Hey people, it's Niaz talking. Now I want to thank one of my subscribers, Pan for Assad, for telling me about this. So a few people in the comments of this article have a few criticisms of it, but you can read that when I post in the description. Anyway, here it goes. The Thibodaux massacre left 60 African Americans dead and spelled the end of unionized farm labor in the South for decades. In 1887, African American cane workers in Louisiana attempted to organize, and many paid their lives. On November 23rd, 1887, a mass shooting of African American farm workers in Louisiana left some 60 dead. Bodies were dumped in unmarked graves while the white press cheered a victory against the fledgling black union. It was one of the bloodiest days in United States labor history, and while statues went up and public places were named for some of those involved, there is no marker of the Thibodaux massacre. Days after, a planter widow, Mary Pugh, wrote, "I think this will settle the question of who is to rule the N-word, I'm not saying that word, or the white man for the next 50 years. It was a far-sighted comment. Black farm workers in the South wouldn't have the opportunity to unionize for generations." Years after the 13th Amendment brought freedom, cane cutters' working lives were already barely distinguishable from slavery, argues journalist and author John DeSantis. His book, The Thibodaux Massacre, Racial Violence and the 1887 Sugarcane Labor Strike, is an excellent and compelling account of the massacre. With no land to own or rent, workers and their families lived in old slave cabins. They toiled in gangs just like their ancestors had for nearly a century. Growers gave workers meals, but paid famine wages of as little as 42 cents a day, 91 cents per hour in today's money for a 12-hour shift. Instead of cash, workers got a script that poured basics at high prices at plantation stores. But they had advantages that their counterparts in cotton areas lacked. Planters needed their labor, and growers living on thin margins failed to attract migrant laborers to replace local workers, especially in the crucial rolling season when the sugar cane needed to be cut and pressed in short order. In the sugar parishes arching through the southern part of the state from Berwick Bay to the Mississippi River, African American men voted the Republican Party, which is a different party now than it was then, don't get confused, which supported black rights, civil rights was stronger in sugar country than anywhere else in the state. By the late 1860s, African Americans became legislators or sheriffs, and black volunteer militias drilled, despite living and working conditions still bearing the marks of slavery. In 1874, 9 years after the slavery ended in the United States, cane cutters demanded a second emancipation. They wanted a living wage, or at least a chance to rent on shares. Planters wanted to cut wages after the lean harvest of 1873-74 coincided with an economic recession. And while Louisiana growers produced 95% of the nation's domestic sugar and molasses, they were losing market share to cheaper foreign sugars. Sensing they were in a strong bargaining position, workers banded together in several sugar parishes, including St. Mary, Iberia, Terrebonne, and Lafourche, demanding cash wages of $1.25 per day, or $1 if meals were included. But the growers refused, upset that African American workers were demanding an end to their paternalistic work regime. So African American leaders like Ham Keyes, a former Terrebonne parish legislator, called a strike. Keyes led a march from Humor to South Down Plantation in Terrebonne, rallying workers with a fiery speech. The sight of black protesters while growers and acting with their interests in mind, the parish's African American sheriff formed a posse of whites to face down strikers. Again, you see that African American sheriff formed a posse of whites. It's just like that Betham guy in Dallas, you know, with the DA. Wow, nothing has changed in 130 years. Anyway, surprised that the opposition, Keyes marchers retreated. In the state capital of New Orleans, relocated to Baton Rouge in 1882, Republican Governor William Pitt Kellogg also backed growers, but he was under a siege from the Louisiana White League, a paramilitary white supremacist group formed in 1874 to intimidate Republicans and keep African Americans from voting. Despite Kellogg's being a pro-growth moderate who favored low taxes, White Leaguers tried to oust him in a violent coup. The Battle of Liberty Place, as it was called, pitted white militiamen against federal troops and metropolitan police. Governor Kellogg was temporarily forced out of New Orleans. He returned in the Guard, but would be Louisiana's last Republican governor for more than 100 years. America was retreating from the Republican-led Reconstruction and abandoning civil rights. African Americans in sugar regions kept the right to vote, but their influence in state elections was waning. As W.E. Du Bois put it in Black Reconstruction in America, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again into slavery. Sugar workers attempted another strike in 1880. Both growers and workers resorted to sporadic violence. But time was on the growers' side. African Americans were being disarmed and thrown out of office, and some were leased out of hard labor for petty and trumped-up crimes. With few options available by 1887, Terrebonne sugar workers reached out to the Knights of Labor. The Knights was the biggest and most powerful union in America. It began organizing African American workers in 1883 in separate locals. A local is a bargaining unit of a broader union. Despite segregation, the Knights organized women and farm workers, and it made strides against Jim Crow. At the Knights' 1886 National Convention in Richmond, Virginia, leaders risked violence by insisting that a black delegate introduce Virginia's segregationist governor. Across the state of the former Confederacy, whites viewed organized labor as agitation that threatened the emerging Jim Crow order. Even in the North and Midwest, the Knights fought an uphill battle against authorities who sided with railroad and mine owners. Several states called out militias to break strikes during the late 19th century, but the Knights was at its peak of the popularity in the 1880s. In Louisiana, the Knights organized sugar workers into 7 locals of 100 to 150 members each. Hamkees joined former black leaders like ex-Sheriff William Kennedy in August of 1887. The Knights met with St. Mary branch of the Louisiana Sugar Planters Association asking for improved wages, and again the growers refused. So the Knights raised the stakes in October of 1887 as the rolling season approached. Julius Bailey, a 29-year-old school teacher, served as a local president in Terrebonne. His office sent a communique all over the region asking for $1.25 a day cash wages, and local workers committee followed up, going directly to growers with the same demand. Instead of bargaining, growers fired union members. Planters like future Supreme Court Chief Justice Edward Douglas White kicked workers off the land, ordering any who stayed arrested. And just take a look at that. The Supreme Court Chief was a planter. So it is very important who is becoming DA or attorneys or prosecutors or whatever, who's the sheriff. Know who they are. The local elections, like Professor Black Truth, are where things really matter. All politics is local. Siding with growers, Democratic newspapers circulated false reports of black-on-white violence. The most vicious and unruly set of Negroes were at the Rienzi plantation near Thibodaux, the New Orleans Daily Became reported. The leader of them said that today that no power on earth could remove them unless they removed as corpses. As the cane ripened, growers called on the governor to use muscle against the strikers, and Samuel D. McHenry, Democratic governor and former planter, obliged, calling for the assistance of several all-white Louisiana militias under the command of ex-Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard. One group touted a 45 caliber Gatling gun, a hand-cranked machine gun, around 2 parishes before parking in front of the Thibodaux courthouse. An army cannon was set up in front of the jail. Then the killing started. In St. Mary, the Attakapas Rangers joined the sheriff, facing down a group of black strikers. With one of the workers reached into a pocket, posse members opened fire on the crowd, and 4 men were shot dead when they stood. Reached into a pocket. Again, the same old excuses. He was reaching for something. Never changes. Terror broke the strike in St. Mary Parish. In neighboring Terrebonne, some small growers came to the bargain table. Large planters hired strike breakers from Vicksburg, Mississippi, 200 miles to the north, promising high wages and bringing them down on trains. The replacement workers were also African Americans, but they lacked experience in the cane breakers. As they arrived, militiamen evicted strikers, and Thibodaux in Lafourche Parish was becoming a refuge for displaced workers. Some moved into vacant houses in town, while others camped along bayous and roadsides. Reports circulated of African American women gossiping about a planned riot. Violence broke out in nearby Lockport on Bayou Lafourche when Moses Perg, a black worker, shot and wounded Richard Ford, a planter, in self-defense. A militia unit arrived and mounted a bayonet charge on gathered workers, firing a volley in the air. But a strike was gaining national attention. Do the working men of the country understand the significance of the movement? Asked Washington, D.C.'s National Republican, pointing out that sugar workers were forced to work at starvation wages, the richest spot under American flag. If forced back to the fields at gunpoint, no wage worker was safe from employer intimidation. In Thibodaux, Lafourche Parish District Judge Taylor Beatty declared martial law. Despite being a Republican, Beatty was an ex-Confederate and White League member. He authorized local white vigilantes to barricade the town, identifying strikers and demanding passes from any African American coming or going. And before dawn on Wednesday, the 23rd of November, pistol shots coming from a cornfield injured 2 white guards. The response was a massacre. There were several companies of white men, and they went around night and day shooting colored men who took part in the strikes, said Reverend T. Jefferson Rhodes of the Moses Baptist Church in Thibodaux. Going from house to house, gunmen ordered Jack Conrad, a Union Civil War veteran, his son Grant, and his brother-in-law Marcellin out of the house. Marcellin protested he was not a striker but was shot and killed anyway. As recounted in John DeSantis' book, Clarice Conrad watched as her brother Grant got behind a barrel and the white man got behind the house and shot him dead. Jack Conrad was shot several times in the arms and chest. He lived and later identified one of the attackers as his employer. One strike leader found in an attic was taken to the town common, told to run, and shot to pieces by a firing squad. An eyewitness told the newspaper no less than 35 Negroes were killed outright, including old and young, men and women. The Negroes offered no resistance. They could not, as the killing was unexpected. Survivors took to the woods and swamps. Killings continued on plantations, and bodies were dumped in a site that became a landfill. Workers returned to the fields on growers' terms while whites cheered a Jim Crow victory. The Daily Picayune blamed black unionizers for violence, saying they provoked the white citizens, suggesting the strikers would burn down the town and end the lives of the white men and children with their cane knives. Flipping the narrative, the paper argued, it was no longer a question of against labor, but one of law-abiding citizens against assassins. The union died with the strikers, and the assassins went unpunished. There was no federal inquiry. Even the coroner's inquest refused to point a finger at the murderers. Sugar planter Andrew Price was among the attackers that morning. He won a seat in Congress the next year. The massacre helped keep unions out of the South at just the moment it was industrializing. Texas manufacturers were moving out of New England, chasing low wages. And after textile factories closed in the 20th century, auto manufacturing and energy companies opened in southern states, in part for the non-union workforce. Southern black farmers workers would not attempt to unionize until the 1930s, when the Southern Tenants Union attracted both white and African members. But it too was met by a violent backlash. Anyway, you can read the article for yourself in the description. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Please comment, rate, share, and subscribe.